So a few months ago, I had the opportunity to present my research on Luke and Acts during an exciting, eye-opening visit to the Pacific Northwest of the United States of America, namely the University of Oregon. As I was preparing my talk for this visit, I remembered that the late Jack T. Sanders had worked there as a professor in New Testament studies. Jack Sanders is best known for his monograph, The Jews in Luke Acts, which was published by Fortress Press in 1987. In that book, Sanders made scathing claims about Luke's hostility towards Jews, accusing him of anti-Semitism. The visit to the University of Oregon afforded me the opportunity to revisit and critically engage with the work of Jack Sanders, who I learned from locals there was the elder brother of none other than the late E.P. Sanders, one of the most important scholars of the New Testament and early Judaism in recent times. Jack Sanders' verdict against Luke depends in part on his analysis of Luke's ecclesiology. For Sanders the Elder, as I will sometimes call him, to differentiate him from E.P. Sanders the Younger, it was evident that Luke understood the new Christian polity to be God's true people. Sanders the Elder relied on two exceptional uses of the Greek term laos, people, in Acts 15 verse 4 and 18 verse 10 to make this claim. His comments on this matter are worth quoting here at length. In Acts 15:4, as a way of resolving the disagreement with the Apostolic Council, James states that Simeon has explained how at first God oversaw taken out of the Gentiles a people for his name, and that Luke shows that he is using a quasi-technical term so to designate Christianity is seen in his considered use of the term people of Israel to designate the Jewish people. See Luke 2:32, Acts 4:10, 13:17, 24, and especially 4:27, where it says Gentiles and peoples of Israel. Most significant, however, is the repeated use of the absolute holaos by the Lucan Paul in Acts 26, verses 17 and 23. When Paul says here that the Lord confirmed to him that he was saving or choosing Paul from the people and from the Gentiles, and when he affirms that it was according to prophecy that Christ should proclaim light to the people and to the Gentiles, the people obviously means the people of Israel. But when the Lord says to Paul in a dream in Acts 18:10, I have a numerous people, laos, estin moi polus, in this city, he means the church, made up, as verses 7 to 8 had explained, of Jews and Gentiles. Thus, Luke understands that he is shifting the pre-Christian understanding of people of God as Christians. Yervel's proposal that Luke thinks of a people and an associate people is therefore a misreading of the evidence. End of the quote by Jack Sanders. Sanders the Elder nicely encapsulates in this paragraph some of the key issues in the debate over the identity of Israel in Luke Acts. One of the key issues concerns terminology. Jack Sanders knew well that the term laos is almost invariably applied in both Luke and Acts to Israel or to Jewish multitudes. Sanders the Elder admits as much when he goes on to say that for Luke, people of Israel or just Israel always means the Jews. Luke's terminological precision would imply that the people of God are in fact the people of Israel, and that the Gentiles who have recently accepted Jesus as their master and savior constitute a second additional people that is associated with Israel, but not Israel proper, as the Norwegian prophet Jacob Jervel, whom Sanders criticizes, had long ago suggested. Now, I customarily refer to Jervel as a prophet of sorts because his oracles on Luke Acts were too avant-garde for his time to receive the recognition that they merited. especially in Germanic circles, where Hans Conzelmann and Ernst Henschen dictated the Forschungsgeschichte of Luke Acts for much of the second half of the 20th century. Even before Sanders the Younger had written his seminal book, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, Yervel was proposing a new perspective on Luke Acts, the results of which are now being refined and cemented by a newer generation of scholars who see Luke Acts as a Jewish composition throughout, rather than a Gentile Christian text. Jack Sanders worked his way around Luke's rather consistent terminological application of laos by relegating Israel's status as the people of God to past history. Since Jesus' first coming, Israel's special election and purpose in history had been transferred to the church, the new people of God. Israel, in Jack Sanders' own words, is what Luke meant by people of God, that is, the people through whom and to whom God's salvation has come. Israel, in other words, meant, but no longer means people of God for Luke. Israel, rather, refers to the Jews, a group that, in Sanders' estimation, can only carry negative connotations in Luke Acts. Although Jack Sanders disagreed with Yaakov Yervel on the role of Israel and the identity of the church in Luke Acts, he nevertheless shared with the Norwegian oracle the assumption that Luke refers to two peoples of God in his writings, save that for Sanders, one of these peoples, namely Israel, gives way to a new laos that continues the mission and fulfills the destiny of the former. Whereas Yervel suggested that Gentile Christ followers become a new polity alongside Israel, which retains its identity as God's people in the present time through the existence of a Jewish Christian contingent of believers, Sanders argued that the church emerged as God's new laos after the dissolution of the previous laos, Israel. I will return to this issue during this presentation. It involves questions of ecclesiology and soteriology that are intertwined with ethical decisions we are obligated to consider as interpreters of the Bible, given Luke's ambiguity about the status of Gentile Christ followers and the turbulent history of Christian-Jewish relations that ensued in the centuries after Luke's time. Can there be two peoples or only one people of God existing or coexisting at any given time according to Luke's ecclesiological configuration? Before answering this question, I want to contextualize Luke's understanding of Israel within its early Jewish framework by engaging with the recent scholarship of Jason Staples, which I understand has prompted the selection of the topic of Israel's restoration for discussion at this conference. In my opinion, Jason Staples has convincingly shown that many Jews throughout the Second Temple period continued to view Israel as an entity that encompassed not only Jews, that is, the descendants of Judah, but all the 12 tribes of Israel. Despite its supremacy and significance, the tribe of Judah, whence comes the terms Jews and or Judeans, did not efface the identity of the northern tribes of Israel, which had purportedly been exiled by the Assyrians in the 8th century BCE, through a semantic equivalence whereby the term Jew exhausted the pan-tribal connotations of Israel proper. Well into the 1st century CE and even beyond, the belief in the survival of the so-called lost tribes of the Israelite North persisted in the Jewish imaginaire, with many texts, biblical and extra-biblical, foretelling their redemption from exile and reunification with the Judahite South. Hope for this kind of pan-Israelite restoration is embedded in the following recitation daily mentioned in Jewish liturgy till this very day, right after the morning Shema and before the Amidah, a rabbinic prayer. Sur Yisrael, rock of Israel. Kuma be'ezrat Yisrael, arise to the help of Israel. Ufde chinumecha, deliver as you promised or declared. Yehuda ve'Yisrael, Goalenu, our Redeemer. Adonai Tsevaot Shemo, the Lord of hosts is his name. Kedosh Yisrael, the Holy One of Israel. Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, Lord. Ga'al Yisrael, who redeemed Israel. This prayer, already known in some form during early rabbinic times, distinguishes two subgroups within the Israelite nation, Judah and Israel. It does not assume that Judah and Israel are coterminous. Put another way, all Jews may be Israelites, but not all Israelites are Jews. Consider, for example, the case of the Samaritans, who to this day are called Bnei Yisrael in Palestinian Arabic, and who consider themselves Israelites, not Jews. By no means is this a modern differentiation. The Mishnah never considers whether the Samaritans are Yehudim, Hebrew for Jews, but whether they are Yisrael, the standard term used in rabbinic literature for designating Jews and all other members of the Israelite people. The Jewish historian from the first century, Flavius Josephus, made this distinction as well. Even though he despised the Samaritans, he recounts how the Samaritans claim that they are descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh, tracing their genealogy from Joseph. On the other hand, Josephus clarifies that the Jewish people are descended from the tribe of Judah, even though they also include descendants of the tribes of Benjamin and Levi. Whatever one makes of the Samaritan case, we should be careful not to subsume them under the umbrella category of Judaism, as if they were some kind of sect that deviated from the Jewish norm. The terms Judaism and Jew, rarely used in early Jewish literature, did not represent the entire spectrum of Israelites, as the present-day Samaritan scholar Benjamin Tzedakah reminds us, saying, quote, "A biblical researcher who determines that Judaism is the mother religion framework out of which other Jewish units were developed during the first centuries of the period of the Second Temple clearly bends the historical truth. Samaritanism does not stem from Judaism. Both rather represent two different strands of Israelitism that emerged during the Second Temple period. Rather than judging the legitimacy of these cultural expressions, the historian should simply appreciate how ancient Jews and Samaritans alike understood their Israelite heritage and identity." End of quote. Besides the Samaritans and the Jews, who represent the tribes of Joseph and Judah, respectively, we must contend with the persistent belief within early Judaism that remnants of the northern tribes of Israel had somehow continued to survive and even thrive after the Assyrian exile, and that they would consequently experience redemption one day as part of Israel's full eschatological restoration. Josephus himself attests to the endurance of this Jewish hope in the first century CE, claiming that not only had the two southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin, along with some Levite attachés, survived the Babylonian exile, but that also an uncountable number of the 10 remaining tribes allegedly deported by the Assyrians were living in a distant land beyond the Euphrates. Jewish legends about the whereabouts of these 10 tribes continued to accumulate during and after Josephus's time. In the Jewish apocalypse called Second Baruch, probably dating from the end of the first century CE, a legend tells that Baruch sent a letter to the northern tribes by means of an eagle, exhorting them to remain faithful to the Torah so that they might be redeemed. Fourth Ezra, another Jewish apocalypse, contemporaneous with Second Baruch, goes into even more fanciful detail about the adventurous wanderings of the lost tribes. Long ago, the northern tribes had traversed narrow passages of the Euphrates that had miraculously receded and settled in a land far away from the nations of the world in order to properly observe the Torah. which they had transgressed in their own homeland, once and for all. This Jewish pseudepigraphon goes on to predict that these northern tribes will one day return to the land of Israel after the Most High will stop the channels of the river again so that they may be able to cross over. Similar beliefs recorded in early rabbinic sources paved the way for medieval legends that fantasized about the size and valor of these tribes. In modern times, a small number of Jews have crossed the world hunting for remnants of the lost tribes in hope that their supposed discoveries will usher in the Messianic age. I remember years ago when I studied modern Hebrew at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, meeting a classmate named Esther, who told me that she was a member of the B'nai Menashe, a name given to various ethnic groups from northeastern India who identify or are identified with the tribe of Manasseh, some of whom have settled in modern-day Israel, Palestine. If I've spent some time providing a panorama of Israel's tribal configuration, it is because Luke shares much in common in his understanding of Israel with the early Jewish sources just mentioned. First, Luke applies the term Israel or Israelite only to those who were viewed themselves as descending from one of the 12 sons of Jacob. Never does Luke tag Gentiles as Israelites, not even Gentile sympathizers of Judaism or followers of Jesus. Luke even avoids indexing Samaritans as Israelites, although he seems to suggest that the mutual recognition by Jews and Samaritans of Jesus's messianic authority is an integral part of the eschatological program leading to the full restoration of Israel. Luke's indexing of Israel begins in the opening to his gospel, where Miriam, better known as Mary, praises God who has, quote, helped, antelabeto in Greek, his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy as he spoke to our ancestors, to Abraham and to his seed forever, end quote. This is from Luke 1:54-55. As I have argued in my book, Luke's Jewish Eschatology, the language used here and elsewhere in Luke Acts is steeped in Israel's scriptures and does not depart from the scriptural understanding of Israel's identity. Israel is none other than the chosen people descended from Abraham. Luke does not redefine or messianize Abraham's seed as Paul attempts to do in Galatians in order to include Gentile Christ followers. Sperma in Greek or zera in Hebrew retains its native connection to those who trace their lineage back to Abraham and Sarah via Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob, Leah, Rachel, Zilpah, and Bilhah. Jewish protagonists in Luke and Acts accordingly and naturally refer to Abraham and the patriarchs of Israel as our fathers. See Luke 1:54, verse 72, 73, chapter 3, verse 8, Acts 3:13, 5:30, chapter 7, verse 2, etc., etc. Some readers single out two passages in the third gospel in a misguided attempt to prove that Luke has revised the traditional Jewish understanding of Zera Avraham. In the first instance, Yohanan, the immerser, anachronistically called John the Baptist, warns his Israelite interlocutors that God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. That's Luke 3:8. This pronouncement, however, is hortatory in character. Yohanan is not offering some kind of radical new ecclesiology, but simply warning his fellow Jews against complacency, hoping to spur them to repentance in preparation for the coming judgment. His declaration is not any different from the warnings of the Hebrew prophets, such as Amos, who admonished Israel against presumptuousness by reminding them that they were no better in God's eyes than other nations such as the Ethiopians, the Philistines, or the Arameans. The second case is the famous story of Zacchaeus, whom I prefer to call by his original Hebrew name Zakkai to underscore his Jewish membership. A resident of Jericho, Zakkai is a Jew from Judea living in a Judean town. His Jewish pedigree is not in doubt. The problem has to do with the reputation of his métier. He is a tax collector, a chief tax collector at that, which in the eyes of his fellow Jews potentially implicates him in unfair practices and even complicity with foreign imperial powers. His Jewish neighbors question his moral character, not his Jewish heritage. They rhetorically deny that he is a child of Abraham because they expect better treatment from an Israelite they suspect is defrauding the Jewish people. No good Jew would act in a way that would prejudicate the welfare and even livelihood of the Jewish community. One can readily think of contemporary analogies in which the Jewish community at large has publicly disowned a fellow Jew out of embarrassment or resentment for their immoral behavior. Zacchaeus, before his repentance, shares more in common with Bernie Madoff than with George Santos. George Santos is not a Jew, even if he has infamously and misleadingly claimed to be Jewish. Madoff, on the other hand, enjoyed Jewish recognition before becoming a persona non grata for defrauding countless investors, including many fellow Jews. When Jesus therefore declares in Luke that today salvation has happened to this household because Zakkai too is a son of Abraham, he is publicly signaling to the Jewish community that Zakkai has had a change of heart and should be welcomed back into the Jewish fold. The Jewish community no longer needs to treat Zakkai with suspicion as some kind of untrusted outsider. Indeed, Zakkai has receipts that document his change of behavior. The Jewish tax collector has pledged to give half of his possessions to the poor and to reimburse fourfold those he has defrauded. This is the kind of ethical behavior that Jews expect from a fellow child of Abraham. The only other instance in Luke's gospel where a single individual is called a child of Abraham confirms my reading that Luke is not redefining the traditional Jewish understanding of who is a child of Abraham and therefore an Israelite. This occurs when Jesus heals a bent woman in a Jewish synagogue on the Sabbath. To justify his treatment of a non-life-threatening condition on the Shabbat, Jesus highlights the woman's special standing as a daughter of Abraham. The meaning of this phrase is straightforward. No need to infer that Israelite identity is being revised here based on moral behavior or confessional belief. The woman has done nothing to earn the right to become a child of Abraham. She simply is a daughter of Abraham because she, like Jesus and the other Jews attending the synagogue on the Sabbath, was born into the Israelite line of Abraham's household. In fact, Jesus' healing of this Israelite woman exemplifies how God is fulfilling the promise to Abraham and the patriarchs to bless and help Israel. To quote again Luke's own words, God has helped ante labeto his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, nestenai eleus, as he spoke to our ancestors, to Abraham and to his seed forever. Luke 1:54-55. Sabbath controversy aside, the rationalization in Luke for Jesus' intervention on behalf of this daughter of Abraham could not be any more Jewish in its formulation. By invoking the bent woman's familial relationship to Abraham, Luke's Jesus activates the memory of God's covenant made with Abraham, which was subsequently renewed with Isaac and Jacob. The remembrance to show mercy, nestenai eleus, as Luke puts it, a phrase inspired by the Hebrew combination zachar and chesed that one encounters, for example, in the biblical Psalms, there in reference to God's deliverance of Israel in fulfillment of the covenantal promises, and later in the first blessing of the rabbinic Amidah, called the rabbinic blessing in the prayer called Amidah, called Avot, which was already known in Tannaitic times, so sometime in the first 2 centuries CE, and which invokes the merits of the patriarchs as follows. Blessed are you, Lord our God, and God of our fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, who remembers the mercy of the fathers, and who brings a deliverer to the children of their children, for his name's sake in love. Like the Gospel of Luke, the Acts of the Apostles only indexes Israelites as children of Abraham. This can be seen in speeches Jewish speakers give to Jewish crowds to whom they refer to as Israelites, Andres Israelitai in the Greek, and speak of the patriarchs as our fathers. Peter's second address to a Jewish crowd gathered in Jerusalem finally illustrates this point. After addressing his Jewish audience as fellow Israelites, literally Israelite men, Peter declares that the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of our ancestors, glorified his servant Jesus. Building on this shared sense of Israelite ancestry, Peter emphasizes that Jesus' messianic calling concerns his Jewish listeners first and foremost, since they are the descendants of Abraham and heirs of the covenant, as he goes on to say, you are the descendants of the prophets and of the covenant that God gave to your ancestors, saying to Abraham, and in your descendants all the families of the earth shall be blessed. When God raised up his servant, he sent him first to you to bless you by turning each of you from your wicked ways. That's Acts 3, verses 25 to 26. Though a defender of Paul, the author of Acts provides surprisingly little here to suggest that either the Messiah or those who joined the Messiah through faithfulness are Abraham's seed. One prominent commentator of the Acts of the Apostles nevertheless contends that Acts 3, 25 to 26, quote, reveal Luke's appropriation of Pauline theology. Gentiles can also be heirs of Abraham and thus of the covenant, but the announcement is made to Jews first, end quote. Yet Luke avoids equating Gentile Christ followers with children of Abraham. Unlike Galatians, Acts does not declare anywhere that the families of the earth become Abraham's sperma. Instead, they are blessed through Abraham's sperma, which is understood in Acts in its natural corporate sense. If one searches for a Pauline parallel to Acts 3:25 to 26, it shall be found in the letter to the Romans. There, Paul states that the Messiah is katasarka, according to the flesh, from Israel, Romans 9:5. From Israel came the Messiah, and the Messiah of Israel was an Israelite, a Jewish Davidite, to be more precise, as Paul specifies in Romans 1:3. The Son of God is ex spermatos David. All of this agrees not only with Peter's statement in Acts 3:25 that the Messiah comes from the sperma of Abraham, understood in a physical corporate sense, but with what Paul says in Acts 13 verse 23. Of this man, that is David's posterity, spermatos, God has brought to Israel a savior, Jesus, as he promised. What then of the new Gentile aficionados who have joined the Jesus movement? While Luke shies away from calling them Israelites or even Abrahamites, he nevertheless assigns to them a holy standing. The sacred calling of Gentile Christ followers is proclaimed in Acts 15 by none other than the head of the Jerusalem ecclesia and brother of Jesus named Jacob, or Jacobi in Italian, not James or Giacomo, as virtually all modern translations in English and other modern languages misrender his name, thereby obscuring the connection with Jacob, the patriarch, who was later renamed Israel. As the president of the Jerusalem Council and eponymous bearer of the Israelite patriarch, Jacob, the brother of Jesus, declares that God has seen to it, episkepsato in the Greek, to take a people from among the nations, Acts 15:14. The Greek verb episkepsato recalls the Hebrew pakad, a verb used in the Hebrew scriptures to describe God's favorable intervention on behalf of Israel. Episkepsato accordingly can be translated as saw to it, looked favorably on, or even visited. Jacob's main point in Acts is that the time has come of age for non-Jews among the nations to experience salvation just as Israel has in the past and present. God has therefore decided to take or choose from labein ek, the nations, ethnon, a new people, laos, for God's name. This verbal construction suggests that candidates from the ethne have been divinely selected, plucked out from the nations to form an international conglomerate that boasts an election on par with Israel's own holy vocation. Gentile followers of Jesus are a holy laos, just like the people of Israel. But how exactly does this new election relate to Israel's own standing as God's chosen people? Several models present themselves. First, there is the traditional supersessionist model, which envisions the church as the exclusive claimant of Israel's identity, depriving the Jewish people of its holy status. This model blatantly assumes that the church has replaced Israel, or is the true Israel, while the Jewish polity is no longer God's chosen people because it has, by and large, failed to recognize Jesus' messiahship. At its core, this form of replacement theology states, "You are no longer you. I am really you." Justin Martyr is one of the first Christians to articulate this view. Before Trypho the Jew, he declares, "We Christians are true Israel." If we were to apply this model to Luke Acts, it would mean that Israel was once the laos of God, but is no longer. The ecclesia of Christ having assumed that role. Individual Jews may join or rejoin true Israel if they confess Jesus as their Christ, but the rest of the Jewish politeia has been cut off. Hans Conzelmann was a modern proponent of this theological perspective for Luke Acts. A second equally supersessionist model attempts to soften its supersessionist overtones by emphasizing the continuity between church and Israel, substituting the language of replacement with euphemistic terms such as reconfiguration or redefinition. In so doing, it deflects the charge of supersessionism by claiming that Israel has never been replaced, but has remained all along, even though it has naturally morphed into the church, seen as a divinely willed outgrowth of Israel. This model may further emphasize the Jewish roots of Christianity by claiming that its theology is anchored in the Hebrew scriptures and finds precedent in Second Temple Judaism and is therefore perfectly Jewish. It denies that there is any diachronic rupture between Israel and the church, or a replacement of the former by the latter. Israel's preordained line of history extends uninterrupted into the present-day life of the church. The Anglican bishop N.T. Wright is the modern champion of this perspective, and he vociferously denies that any of his talk about the reconfiguration of Israel is anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. As a Jew, I must personally say that I would rather deal with Justin Martyr, who is at least forthright about his supersessionism, because the outcome of Wright's theology for the Jewish people is the same as that of the church father of Neapolis, save that it is harder to expose, garbled as it is in a verbose cloak that apologetically pretends to be Jewish. According to Wright's theological scheme, the Jewish people ultimately have no meaningful purpose in history unless it capitulates to the Christological reconfiguration of Israel's calling. If the Jewish people are not replaced, they are certainly displaced from their vocation, relegated to the sidelines to witness the church, qua reconfigured Israel, fulfill salvation history. This model finds many adepts in Lucan scholarship, which is permeated by a discourse that describes Luke's history of the church's beginnings in terms of continuity versus discontinuity with Judaism. A third option conceives of Israel as a composite unity that distinguishes within itself Jews from non-Jews. Gentiles are incorporated into Israel, albeit without becoming Jews. They share in the blessings promised to Abraham and his seed, but not as Jews proper. They are children of Abraham, perhaps even Israelites, though not Jewish Israelites. Jason Staples has recently proposed a model along these lines for comprehending Paul's Israelology. According to Staples, Paul related the Gentiles who confessed Jesus with the northern tribes of Israel, whom he believed had assimilated among the nations since the Assyrian exile. For Paul, so Staples argues, the mass influx of Gentiles into the Jesus movement meant that all 12 tribes of Israel were being restored, not just the Jews, the descendants of Judah. As stated earlier, I believe that Staples has brought to our attention and illuminated a neglected and misunderstood aspect of the meaning of the term Israel during the Second Temple period. Moreover, his work on Paul brings necessary correctives and fresh insights to Pauline studies that I can only deal with briefly here. First, I recognize that Paul may have associated Gentile Christ followers with Israel to a greater degree than I have been willing to admit in previous publications. However, I'm not sure that Paul specifically identified Gentile Christ followers with the northern tribes of Israel. This is certainly harder to establish for Luke Acts. First, Luke's rather consistent terminological precision stands in the way of this identification. Luke, as one may recall, does not even call Gentiles children of Abraham, let alone children of Jacob or Israel. Furthermore, one must reckon in Luke Acts with at least two other candidates for northern tribal representation. One, the Samaritans, and two, the supposed remnants of the northern tribes themselves. Samaritans receive special attention in Luke Acts. Unlike Matthew, Luke reports that Jesus did send his disciples on a mission into Samaritan territory. This operation, though initially unsuccessful, paves the way for the Samaritan outreach that is later reported in Acts 8. Indeed, the commission given by the resurrected Jesus in Acts 1, 7-8, in response to his disciples' inquiry about the restoration of the kingdom to Israel, suggests that Luke views the recruitment of the Samaritans as an integral part of Israel's eschatological renewal. Given Luke's pronounced interest in the fate of the Samaritans, not to mention the Samaritans' own self-perception, it can hardly be coincidental that Samaria is singled out in the missiological map that is outlined in Acts 1:8. But you will receive power when the sacred spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. If Luke considered the Samaritans to be Israelites, then their submission to Jesus, as reported in Acts 8 and approved by the Judean headquarters in Jerusalem, can be seen as a partial fulfillment of the biblical prophecies predicting the healing of the wounds that tore Israel apart in the days of King Rehoboam. In order for this reconciliation to take place, however, both Jews and Samaritans, according to Luke, must recognize and submit to Jesus' messianic authority. Additionally, Jews are challenged to accept the Israelite identity of their Samaritan neighbors. This may well be one of the original points of the so-called parable of the Good Samaritan. The parable, whose subtleties would have made sense only to a Jewish audience familiar with Jewish praxis and the topography of the land of Israel, is directed in the world of Luke's text toward a Jewish interlocutor, an expert in Jewish law, in response to his follow-up question, "Who is my neighbor?" After a brief introduction relating the assault of a Jewish man traveling to Jericho, the parable presents three entrance scenes of 1, a priest, 2, a Levite, and 3, a Samaritan. A Jewish audience would have expected the introduction of a Jewish protagonist in the third entry scene, since the parable undoubtedly assumes the traditional Jewish triad that divides Israel into priests, Levites, and Israelites. The original shock value of this parable for its Jewish audience, subsequently lost during the long process of gentilizing and universalizing Luke's gospel, is not only that the Samaritan was a good human, but that he was an Israelite neighbor. If Luke thinks that Jews need to correct their prejudices about their Samaritan neighbors, he nevertheless defines Israel from a Judeo-centric perspective. The Messiah for Luke is a Judahite, a Davidic king born in Bethlehem, whose 12 disciples are all Jews themselves. The Jesus movement, furthermore, is stationed in Jerusalem, which occupies the center of Luke's narrative world from the beginning to the end, of his twofold account. Moreover, the proper site for the earthly temple cult is the city of Jerusalem, not Mount Gerizim, according to Luke Acts. None of these assertions prioritizes Samaritan beliefs. The Samaritans, though Israelites, must do their part in repenting in order for the reconciliation between Judah and Ephraim to materialize. Simply put, Luke was Jewish, not Samaritan. There are indications in Luke Acts that the re-inclusion of the Samaritans into the Israelite commonwealth does not exhaust Israel's eschatological restoration. Intriguingly, Luke refers to a certain Hannah, a prophetess residing in the temple of Jerusalem, who prayed day and night for the liberation of Jerusalem. Luke specifies that she descended from the tribe of Asher. The reference to Asher is curious, as nothing particularly noteworthy is recorded about this minor Israelite tribe in Jewish scripture and tradition. Elsewhere, I have suggested that Luke's specification reflects the eschatological belief in the pan-tribal restoration of Israel that is attested in contemporary Jewish writings, such as the works of Josephus, 2nd Baruch, and 4th Ezra. Luke may well have believed that not only the two tribal heavyweights, Joseph and Judah, but Israel in its tribal plenitude would be redeemed and regathered under one Jewish king. In Acts, the realization of this hope is triggered by Jesus' resurrection, the first one to rise from the dead, which implies the future resurrection of many more and the eschatological renewal of Israel, since the general resurrection and the national redemption of Israel are intertwined in Jewish restoration eschatology. Paul in Acts and in Romans seems to assume this when he testifies to the hope of the promise given to our forefathers, toward which our 12 tribes hope to attain, serving, just like Hannah the Asherite did to God, day and night. See Acts chapter 26, verses 6 to 7. The hope for the restoration of all 12 tribes is further assumed in the promise that Jesus makes to his 12 disciples at the Last Supper. I confer on you, just as my Father has conferred on me, a kingdom, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Luke 22, verses 29 to 30. These considerations lead me to conclude with a fourth ecclesiological option, a bilateral ecclesiology composed of two chosen laoi, the people of Israel and the community of Gentile Christ followers. Together, these two profess a common confession, albeit without violating the identity of the other. Gentiles are not confused with Israelites, nor do they have to become Israelites in order to be saved. Instead, they go through their own process of purification and sanctification that transforms them into a holy people. Jews, for their part, according to Luke, must also confess Jesus, but they do not have to forsake their Jewishness. On the contrary, all of the Jewish followers of Jesus, including Paul, remain faithful to the Torah and to the Jewish people. To be sure, Jewish individuals who do not confess Jesus run the risk of being cut off from Israel, but they remain Jews nonetheless. Jewish identity as such is not tied to confessing Jesus. It is intrinsic to any person who is born and thrown out there into the world as a Jew. This bilateral ecclesiology does not equate the church with Israel. Instead, it subsumes the Israelite laos and the laos ton ethnon under the general assembly that unites Israelites qua Israelites and Gentiles qua Gentiles in their common confession of Jesus as the Messiah of Israel and the nations. Ecclesia, for lack of a better word, is a term that we may use to describe this united but not uniform entity. Admittedly, even this bilateral model that is proposed for comprehending Luke's Israelology still contains a soft dose of supersessionism, since it assumes that Jews ultimately must recognize Jesus as the Messiah of Israel. If I put on my kippah, which I do with greater discretion and caution since October 7, I will have to object to this confessional expectation. As a Jew, I do not agree that Jews must believe in Jesus as Christians do in order to guarantee a spot in the world to come or to fulfill their destiny as members of the Israelite people. As a historian of religion, however, I believe that it is an ethical duty to strive to recover, to the extent that this endeavor is possible, the original message of the biblical text we study, even when that message may not align with our personal beliefs. In cases, however, where the specific meaning of a text in its original historical context are not as clearly discernible as desired, with multiple reasonable interpretations presenting themselves, the theological adoption of the reading that does the least damage to the integrity of the text, as well as to the subjects who may be concerned, assumes a higher ethical priority. In my estimation, the fourth ecclesiological option infringes the least on Israel's identity and the Church's Christological confession, and may even provide a way to formulate a theology that abandons supersessionism altogether. Thank you.